In the opening months of 1942, as the Pacific War expanded with staggering speed, a handful of small and largely forgotten Marine detachments found themselves scattered across some of the most remote outposts in the Central Pacific. These islands, tiny coral specks across the Gilberts and Marshalls, were never intended to withstand full-scale invasion. Yet they became the first line of American resistance during Japan's explosive advance. Most Americans today know the headlines: Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, Midway. But few have ever heard the names of the Marines who served on islands so small they rarely appeared on contemporary maps, places like Macon, Abemama, and Butaritari. Even fewer know that some of them simply vanished. At the time, their role was straightforward but unforgiving: defend isolated naval radio stations and seaplane anchors long enough to relay intelligence back to Pearl Harbor. The men came from the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, an improvised unit stretched thin across thousands of miles. Their equipment often consisted of aging 5-inch naval guns, a scattering of .50 caliber machine guns, and enough rations for a few weeks. Supplies were infrequent and communication lines were fragile, depending on clear weather and functioning transmitters. When Japanese forces began moving south across the Central Pacific, these small detachments quickly shifted from being strategic assets to vulnerable targets. One Marine corporal, writing in his pocket diary days before the first Japanese landings, noted a growing sense of abandonment. "We hear the Navy is pulling back. Radio is weak. If the enemy comes, our guns won't hold them." His words, later recovered from a wallet returned after the war, captured the anxiety that hung over these islands. The strategic calculus in early 1942 was brutal. U.S. planners understood that many of these tiny outposts were indefensible, but withdrawing them risked revealing too much about American intelligence operations. And so, the decision was made, quietly, reluctantly, to leave some detachments in place, knowing they might not survive. In late February 1942, reports began arriving at Pearl Harbor that several Marine positions had gone silent. Initially, it was attributed to storms or radio failures. Yet as hours turned into days, intelligence officers noted the pattern. Every island along the Japanese advance had ceased transmission in the same time frame. Patrol planes dispatched from Canton Island found no signals, no movement, no signs of survivors. One crewman later recalled, "It was like flying over graves the ocean hadn't swallowed yet." The first hints of what happened came from intercepted Japanese naval communications, declassified decades later. These transmissions referenced prisoners taken from enemy garrisons on multiple Gilbert Islands, but the numbers didn't align with known Marine rosters. Some Japanese logs listed only a handful of captives, while other records indicated none were taken at all. Even stranger, U.S. war crimes investigators after 1945 discovered that several Marines believed to have been killed in action never appeared on any Japanese transfer list, execution order, or burial roster. The deeper historians looked, the more contradictions emerged. One intelligence memorandum drafted in 1946 mentions unverified prisoner movement from the Gilberts to Truk and onward to mainland interrogation centers. But without names, dates, or matching Japanese paperwork, the trail went cold. By the time the records were cross-referenced in the 1950s, many of these documents were already lost, misfiled, or redacted as part of broader Cold War secrecy. To understand their disappearance, one must consider the nature of Pacific warfare in 1942. In those early months, chaos defined every front. Japanese landing forces often attacked at night, using small, fast-moving parties that overwhelmed small garrisons before radio operators could send distress calls. If any Marines survived initial contact, their fate depended on split-second decisions, whether to flee into dense jungle scrub, surrender, or mount a final stand behind crude sandbag walls. Survivors were rare and records even rarer. Modern military analysts studying these cases suggest that fragmentation of communication networks likely contributed to the confusion. Many detachments were composed of fewer than a dozen Marines, often lacking experienced staff officers who could maintain accurate logs during crisis moments. When the war swept past these islands, surviving documentation was either destroyed by retreating defenders or captured by Japanese forces who later burned sensitive material during their own withdrawals. The result is a historical void, one in which men simply disappear from the record, leaving only unanswered questions and scattered clues. Today, when historians revisit these archives, they find themselves confronted by a troubling reality. Some Marines assigned to these forgotten outposts were never officially declared killed in action. Instead, their status remains missing decades after the guns fell silent. They stand as some of the earliest and least understood casualties of the Pacific War, overshadowed by the massive battles that followed. And yet, the story of these missing detachments is only the beginning. Because as the war moved deeper into the Pacific, other Marine units would disappear under far more mysterious circumstances. Cases where surviving radio messages abruptly cut off, patrols vanished without a trace, and intelligence reports contradicted one another. The next episode begins with one such disappearance, on a remote atoll called Macon, where the truth became even harder to unravel. In August 1942, as the United States tried to regain momentum in the Pacific, the tiny atoll of Macon, part of the Gilbert Islands, became the site of one of the most perplexing Marine disappearances of the war. The men stationed there were members of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, a unit originally intended to man coastal guns and provide anti-aircraft protection for remote naval outposts. But Macon was different. Its location placed it directly in the path of Japan's southward advance, and by the time U.S. forces realized its growing vulnerability, the window for evacuation had already closed. Within weeks, these Marines would vanish into the fog of wartime record-keeping, leaving behind one of the most debated mysteries in Marine Corps history. By early August, Japanese forces had begun probing the outer Gilbert chain. Patrol planes reported unusual naval movements around Tarawa, and communications from Macon grew increasingly strained. The Marines on the island, just a handful of men, knew their situation was deteriorating. Their supply ship had been diverted elsewhere, and replacement radio parts never arrived. These were indicators that often accompanied isolation, abandonment, and the grim acceptance that reinforcements wouldn't be coming. A surviving fragment from a Marine's notebook captured their mood with blunt honesty: "If they land here, we're on our own." On August 17th, Japanese forces did land. The speed and violence of the attack caught the defenders off guard. Early Japanese reports describe a swift landing by a detachment from the 3rd Special Naval Landing Force, elite troops trained for rapid island seizures. Machine gun positions were neutralized within minutes. Coconut log bunkers, built in haste by the Marines, were breached with grenades and bayonets. Yet even in the midst of this chaos, there were inconsistencies. Japanese after-action reports list only a few prisoners taken on the island, but U.S. casualty lists indicate a larger Marine presence than the number of confirmed dead found after the battle. This discrepancy has puzzled historians for decades. Some suggest that several Marines fled into the interior, attempting to evade capture in the dense undergrowth. Others point to Japanese interrogation notes that mention foreign prisoners transferred to Tarawa in late August, records that do not match known Navy personnel but could align with the missing Marines. However, these notes are vague, lacking names, dates, or unit identifiers. The Japanese clerks who drafted them often used generalized terms, leaving room for misinterpretation. Years later, when U.S. intelligence analysts reviewed captured Japanese archives in preparation for war crimes trials, they encountered even more contradictions. One document referenced enemy personnel transported to Kwajalein for questioning. Another claimed that no prisoners had been taken at all from Macon. The problem was compounded by the destruction of Japanese administrative centers late in the war, when retreating commanders burned sensitive documents. Whatever records might have explained the fate of the missing Marines may have been lost forever in those fires. For families awaiting word, the confusion was devastating. Many received telegrams stating their sons were missing in action following the fall of Macon. Others were told conflicting stories, that their loved ones had been killed during the initial assault, or that they were believed to be prisoners of war. Letters sent to the Marine Corps inquiring about new intelligence were answered with cautious, often non-committal phrasing. One official reply read, "We continue to investigate all potential leads regarding personnel unaccounted for in the Gilbert operations." But behind the scenes, investigators were nearly as lost as the families, trapped in a maze of incomplete data. This case took an even stranger turn in 1946, when U.S. Army war crimes investigators studying Japanese POW transfer records noticed a gap. Several prisoner transports departed Tarawa and Kwajalein during late 1942, yet no complete manifest survived. Some survivors of those transports later testified that a small group of Americans had been aboard, but they could not confirm whether they were Marines, sailors, or civilian contractors. One survivor recalled seeing men in faded khaki with no rank patches, a possible reference to the Macon defenders. Modern scholars examining these events caution against drawing definitive conclusions. The Pacific War was notoriously chaotic, and record-keeping on both sides suffered from logistical strain, hasty retreats, and the destruction of evidence. But the possibility that some Marines were captured and later moved to interrogation centers in the Marshall Islands or even the Japanese home islands remains open. The absence of definitive proof leaves space for speculation, and that ambiguity fuels the enduring mystery of Macon. Understanding this disappearance also offers broader lessons about the early Pacific War. The United States, still reeling from the opening months of disaster, often deployed small units without robust communication or evacuation plans. Intelligence about Japanese movements was limited, and decision-making relied on fragmented, sometimes outdated information. These vulnerabilities created situations where men could be lost, physically, administratively, or both. By the time the Marines launched a major raid on Macon in August 1942, led famously by Carlson's Marine Raiders, the island had already changed hands, and whatever clues existed about the missing defenders were long gone. Raider accounts mention finding scattered gear, rusted weapons, and abandoned defensive positions, but nothing that clarified the fate of the earlier garrison. The mystery of Macon forms the second chapter in a larger pattern, one that repeats across the vast geography of the Pacific Theater. Because as U.S. forces pushed deeper toward the Solomons, more specialized Marine units were thrust into reconnaissance missions where isolation, confusion, and the unforgiving terrain made disappearance an ever-present risk. And the next of those stories leads us into the dense jungles of New Georgia, a place where entire patrols vanished without leaving so much as a single shell casing. In the summer of 1943, the Solomon Islands became the setting for one of the most confounding disappearances in Marine Corps history. The campaign for New Georgia, overshadowed today by the larger and more famous battles of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, was a grinding, brutal fight through some of the most inhospitable terrain in the Pacific. Dense jungle, razor-backed ridges, suffocating humidity, and constant Japanese counterattacks created an environment where a patrol could vanish in minutes. Among the most at risk were the Marine Raiders, elite units tasked with reconnaissance and deep penetration missions far ahead of the main Allied line. Their disappearance on New Georgia remains a story layered with fog, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. The 1st Marine Raider Regiment, under Colonel Harry Liversedge, had been deployed to support Army operations attempting to cut through the Japanese defensive network around Bairoko Harbor. Intelligence was scarce, aerial photographs were often obscured by cloud cover, and the enemy's movements were unpredictable. Into this chaos, Raider scouts were dispatched in small teams to map trails, identify ambush positions, and intercept Japanese couriers. One such patrol left the perimeter on a humid July evening, 4 Marines lightly equipped, moving silently into the trees with only a compass, 2 radios, and a few days' rations. Their mission was simple: track a suspected Japanese resupply route running parallel to the coast. They were never seen again. The struggle for New Georgia was a nightmare even for seasoned combat veterans. Trails dissolved into mud, controlling landmarks was impossible, and rainfall turned ravines into torrents within minutes. Raiders often described losing visibility beyond a few feet. One squad leader later wrote in his diary, "This jungle is like a living thing. It closes around you. If a man fell behind, you might never find him again." The patrol that vanished was navigating terrain so thick that aerial observation was useless, and even nearby gunfire could be swallowed by the canopy. That night, a tropical storm rolled through the area, a storm that may have drowned radio signals and forced the patrol to seek higher ground, inadvertently pushing them deeper into enemy territory. At dawn the next morning, the Raider command post attempted to make radio contact. Static answered back. A second attempt succeeded just barely, fragmented words that observers later described as strained and urgent. The final transmission, recorded at 0542 hours, ended abruptly after a burst of indistinct shouting. Operators tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but no further signals were heard. The patrol's disappearance quickly became a matter of intense concern. In Raider doctrine, reconnaissance patrols were expected to operate independently, but losing all contact within hours was highly unusual. Colonel Liversedge authorized a search, but conditions worked against the rescuers. Japanese units were actively patrolling the same region and had recently reinforced their positions around Bairoko. The Raiders sent to search the jungle found severed branches, signs of struggle, and a discarded cartridge belt, but no bodies, no weapons, no clear direction of movement. One Raider involved in the search recalled, "It was as if the jungle ate them." Yet, the abandoned belt and trampled foliage indicated that something violent had occurred. Japanese records provided little clarity. After the war, Allied officers combed through the surviving documents of the 8th Combined Special Naval Landing Force, but none referenced the capture of Marine Raiders in that area. A single report dated July 23 mentioned a skirmish with American scouts near Enegai Inlet, noting that the enemy withdrew after suffering casualties. However, this report didn't specify whether any prisoners were taken or whether the patrol was entirely destroyed. Other Japanese units in the area were known to bury enemy remains quickly and without documentation, especially during rapid withdrawals. It is possible the patrol was ambushed, overwhelmed, and buried hastily, but no burial site has ever been discovered. Decades later, efforts by the Joint WWII Accounting Command revisited the case using modern forensic mapping. Satellite imagery revealed several ravines and sinkholes previously inaccessible to ground searchers in 1943. Analysts suggested that a combination of combat, disorientation, and flooding could have driven the Marines into these natural traps, where remains could have been concealed for decades. Yet without physical evidence, the hypothesis remains just that, an educated guess. The disappearance also raises broader questions about the risks the raiders were forced to accept. Deep reconnaissance missions were critical, but the small teams were extraordinarily vulnerable. Their equipment was limited, radio reliability was poor in the jungle, and extraction plans were often improvised. Modern military doctrine emphasizes redundancy, multiple radios, backup navigation tools, emergency flares, none of which were standard for Marine patrols during mid-1943. The lessons from New Georgia influenced future raider operations, prompting greater caution and more robust communication protocols. But the personal cost remained. Letters to families were brief and vague, often citing operational uncertainty or inability to confirm circumstances surrounding the disappearance. Some parents wrote repeatedly to Marine headquarters seeking updates, only to receive the same carefully worded replies. Without remains, the Marines could not officially be listed as killed in action, leading to years of painful ambiguity. In the broader tapestry of the Pacific War, the loss of a four-man patrol may seem small. Yet their disappearance symbolizes the harshest truth of the jungle campaigns, that death could come quietly, suddenly, without witness, leaving nothing behind. And as the campaign shifted northward, toward even more heavily defended islands, the Marines would face new environments where disappearance was not just possible, it was common. The next chapter in this story unfolds in the waters between Saipan and Tinian, where a Marine reconnaissance team vanished during a mission that began, like so many others, with quiet confidence and ended in total silence. By mid-1944, the Pacific War had shifted into a new and deadly phase. The brutal island-to-island campaign had carried U.S. Marines across Tarawa, the Marshalls, and the Marianas, closer than ever to Japan's defensive perimeter. Amid this advance, one of the most enigmatic disappearances of the entire Marine Corps occurred between two islands separated by only a few miles of turquoise water: Saipan and Tinian. What began as a routine pre-invasion reconnaissance mission by a small team from the 4th Marine Division ended in silence, uncertainty, and a trail of documents that pointed in multiple directions but supplied no concrete truth. On July 18, 1944, mere days before U.S. forces launched their assault on Tinian, Marine planners needed updated intelligence on tidal patterns, beach gradients, minefields, and Japanese fortifications. Tinian, though smaller than Saipan, was fortified with remarkable precision by the 50th Japanese Infantry Regiment and a network of embedded naval garrisons. The beaches most favorable for landing appeared narrow and extremely controlled by interlocking machine gun nests. The Marines required real-time verification of these assumptions, and that responsibility fell to a four-man reconnaissance team drawn from the 4th Marine Division's scout and sniper platoon. Their mission was deceptively simple: depart Saipan in a rubber boat shortly after dusk, approach Tinian's western shore without detection, collect measurements, observe enemy movements, and return under the cover of darkness. These reconnaissance insertions had become increasingly common throughout the Pacific Campaign, and the men selected were among the most skilled swimmers and navigators in the division. At 2,100 hours, they pushed their small craft into the water, paddling silently beyond the reef line as Navy destroyers shelled distant targets to mask any sound. Eyewitnesses on Saipan watched the craft fade into the night until the small outline disappeared against the horizon. It was the last confirmed sighting of the team. Marine logs recorded that the weather was calm at departure, with only moderate winds and no forecasted storms. But in the Marianas, conditions could change rapidly, and around midnight the weather officer aboard USS Maryland reported an unexpected shift: rising swells, scattered squalls, and wind speeds doubling within an hour. Such sudden turbulence could easily have pushed the reconnaissance team off course. Even a slight deviation could send them drifting south toward open water, or north toward Japanese-controlled cliffs bristling with defensive guns. When the team failed to return by sunrise, officers initially assumed they were delaying to avoid enemy patrols. But by mid-morning, concern escalated. Radio messages were broadcast on prearranged frequencies. Patrol boats were dispatched along likely routes of return. None detected a single trace of the Marines, not even fragments of their rubber craft. One Navy coxswain later reported, "The sea was calm again like nothing had happened. No debris, no gear, nothing." Compounding the mystery were conflicting Japanese reports discovered after the war. A captured diary from a Japanese naval ensign stationed on Tinian mentioned a small enemy boat sighted offshore on the night of July 18, followed by sporadic rifle fire toward the waves. Yet no record exists of a confirmed capture or body recovery by Japanese forces. Other Japanese documents, recovered from a bunker on Tinian after its capture, listed no prisoners taken during the week prior to the invasion. If the Marines had been shot, drowned, or captured, the Japanese left no clear record. Analysts studying the incident after the war proposed multiple theories. One suggests the Marines reached Tinian undetected, conducted their reconnaissance, but were discovered during extraction. Under this scenario, they may have been killed on the beach and rapidly buried by Japanese troops, who frequently concealed small skirmishes to maintain operational secrecy. Another theory posits that the team never reached land at all, overturned by sudden swells and carried out to sea, where currents could sweep bodies miles away within hours. A final, more controversial hypothesis introduced in a 1951 Marine Corps investigative memo suggested a possible Japanese capture followed by transfer to military intelligence centers in the Marianas. Yet no corroborating Japanese paperwork has ever been found. The human dimension of the loss is equally haunting. The families of the missing received formal notifications that their sons were lost during reconnaissance operations in the Marianas, but these words provided no closure. One mother wrote repeatedly to Marine headquarters, asking whether her son might have been taken prisoner. The reply, sent nearly 2 years after the war's end, was devastatingly brief. No additional information is available. This disappearance left a permanent mark on Marine reconnaissance procedures. After Tinian, commanders insisted on improved signaling systems, backup boats, and tighter weather monitoring. Future reconnaissance teams carried waterproof flashlights, emergency flares, and redundancy radios to reduce the likelihood of vanishing without trace. These lessons were essential, but came too late for the 4 Marines lost between Saipan and Tinian. Today, researchers revisiting wartime logs, ocean current models, and interviews with surviving veterans still cannot determine the exact fate of the reconnaissance team. The Marianas campaign was enormous, chaotic, and relentlessly violent. Within such a cauldron, 4 men could disappear completely, swallowed by sea, enemy fire, or hurried burial. Yet their story remains deeply unsettling because of its proximity to major operations, its detailed planning, and the total absence of closure. And as the Pacific campaign shifted again, this time toward the blood-soaked coral ridges of Peleliu, another Marine disappearance would occur under even harsher circumstances, in terrain where the very ground seemed to hide the fallen. By September 1944, U.S. forces were pushing into the Palau Islands, preparing for what would become one of the most grueling battles of the Pacific War, the assault on Peleliu. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, was tasked with capturing an island the Japanese believed they could hold indefinitely. With its razor-sharp coral ridges, labyrinthine cave systems, and suffocating humidity, Peleliu was a natural fortress. And somewhere within that hostile terrain, a small Marine fire team disappeared so completely that no trace of them has ever been confirmed. Their fate remains one of the battle's most enduring mysteries. The disappearance occurred during the chaotic first days of the assault on Umurbergal Ridge, known to Marines simply as the Ridges, Bloody Nose Ridge, or more grimly, the Meat Grinder. The fire team belonged to Company K, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, tasked with flanking a heavily fortified Japanese position that dominated the surrounding battlefield. Their mission was limited in scope: advance along a narrow draw, identify an opening between 2 coral spines, and guide the rest of the platoon through. It should have been a brief maneuver. But Peleliu's terrain had a way of turning routine movements into deadly gambles. The struggle began almost immediately. The rising heat, reaching well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, made even short advances exhausting. The coral underfoot shredded boots and tore into skin. Japanese defenders, entrenched deep within interconnected caves, could fire, disappear, and reappear from impossible angles. Marines often reported hearing voices echoing from inside the rock, unable to pinpoint their source. In this maze-like environment, Units frequently became disoriented, separated, or pinned down without warning. Company K's platoon leader later described the moment the fire team stepped off. "I watched them move into the shadow of those rocks. One moment they were there, the next they were gone behind the ridge." The fire team, 4 Marines carrying rifles, grenades, and a portable SR-536 handy-talkie, disappeared behind a jagged coral outcropping. Minutes later, the rest of the platoon advanced to the same position. But the fire team was no longer visible, nor had they transmitted any radio updates. Then came the sounds, single rifle shots, distant yells, and what survivors called a sudden burst of wild firing followed by silence. The platoon attempted to push forward, but Japanese crossfire from hidden apertures forced them back. Without suppressive fire or smoke support, searching the draw became impossible. The ridges funneled incoming fire like a natural amphitheater, creating a killing zone that made movement suicidal. For the next 2 days, Company K tried repeatedly to locate the missing Marines. Each attempt was met with intense machine gun bursts and grenades lobbed from slit openings. The Japanese defenders had perfected the art of concealed fields of fire, making any search effort deadly. When a brief lull came, Marines managed to push partway into the draw where the team vanished. They found spent casings, a shattered canteen, and what appeared to be a drag mark leading into a narrow cave opening. But no bodies, no gear, and no further clues were recovered. After the battle, Japanese officers provided limited information under interrogation. One admitted seeing a small group of Marines attempting to flank the ridge, followed by considerable fighting. Another insisted that no prisoners were taken in that sector, as his unit was ordered to resist to the last man. Neither statement aligned perfectly with battlefield evidence. And both officers were low-ranking. Any accurate record-keeping had likely been destroyed or lost long before their capture. The terrain itself holds many possible explanations. Poliliu's caves were extensive, some stretching for hundreds of feet underground, and many collapsed during or after the battle due to shelling, demolition charges, or natural erosion. Engineers documented multiple sealed chambers on the ridge, some containing remains, others unreachable. It is entirely plausible that the fire team was killed near one such cave, their bodies concealed by debris, rubble, or intentional Japanese burial. The intense combat, overlapping lines of fire, and constant movement further complicated post-battle recovery efforts. In the 1950s and again in the 1990s, recovery teams revisited Poliliu. Some caves were reopened, others mapped, but none yielded definitive evidence of the missing fire team. Interviews with surviving Marines often produced similar accounts. The team advanced into the ridges, fighting erupted, and they were never seen again. One veteran, interviewed in 1994, summed it up with quiet resignation: "Poliliu swallowed men." Modern historians emphasize that Poliliu was uniquely lethal in its topography. Unlike other Pacific battlefields, where recovery of the missing was often possible even months later, Poliliu's natural and man-made cave systems created an environment where casualties could vanish into crevices, sinkholes, or collapsed chambers. Combined with the Japanese practice of sealing tunnels during their final defenses, the potential for permanent loss was extremely high. This disappearance echoes a recurring theme throughout the Pacific War: the way terrain, chaos, and fragmented record-keeping combined to create lasting mysteries. The fire team from Company K became part of a long list of Marines unaccounted for on Poliliu, men whose stories remain incomplete. But their disappearance also sets the stage for the final chapter of our investigation, one rooted not in caves or jungles, but in the fractured post-war record itself, where paperwork gaps, contradictory intelligence, and missing reports obscure the truth as effectively as the Pacific's deepest waters. By the final months of World War II, the Pacific battlefield had transformed from an archipelago of isolated outposts into a trail of devastated islands marked by intense combat and staggering human loss. Yet even as U.S. forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands, the fate of many missing Marines remained unresolved. Their names appeared in scattered unit rosters, incomplete after-action reports, and casualty lists that did not quite match the numbers recorded by field commanders. These clerical fractures formed the foundation of a mystery that would outlive the war itself. In the end, the fog of conflict didn't merely obscure what happened on distant beaches or within jungle ravines, it buried the truth within the bureaucracy that emerged afterward. When the guns went silent in 1945, the task of accounting for every Marine fell to a combination of military analysts, graves registration units, and intelligence officers combing through tens of thousands of pages of captured Japanese documents. Their mission was daunting. Entire filing centers had been destroyed in bombings, and many Japanese officers had burned sensitive records during retreat or surrender. Meanwhile, American paperwork had often been compiled under fire, hurried entries on soggy notebooks or half-completed casualty logs interrupted by enemy artillery. In this environment, errors multiplied, and some Marines simply disappeared from the paper trail altogether. One early indicator of the scale of the problem came in late 1945. A Marine Corps memorandum cross-referencing casualty lists from the Gilberts, Solomons, Marianas, and Palaus revealed dozens of discrepancies. Some Marines listed as killed had no known remains. Others recorded as prisoners never appeared in Japanese POW archives. 5 cases, those of the men described throughout this documentary, shared the same haunting classification: missing, circumstances unknown. Their files, spread across different commands and theaters, reflected different battles, environments, and outcomes, yet they shared one common feature. None offered a clear resolution. The struggle to reconstruct events relied heavily on fragmented first-hand accounts. Veterans were interviewed months or years after combat, their memories shaped by trauma and the passage of time. A Raider veteran from New Georgia recalled hearing a radio transmission and screaming, but could not pinpoint the direction. A Marine from Peleliu insisted he saw one of the missing fire team members fall near a coral ridge, yet maps from the period contradict his location. Even when dozens of testimonies were collected, the puzzle pieces refused to form a complete picture. For investigators, every lead raised new questions. Post-war intelligence added yet another layer of complexity. Analysts reviewing Japanese POW logs found entries suggesting prisoner transfers from small Pacific outposts, possibly including Macon, yet no accompanying manifests survived. Reports from Kwajalein mentioned unidentified American prisoners evacuated in late 1942, but no names were listed. Meanwhile, certain U.S. interrogation files reference sightings of American personnel in poor condition on islands that had not been fully investigated before the war's end. None of this evidence was definitive, all of it hinted at possibilities. The Pacific War had produced gaps wide enough to swallow certainty. A key insight emerged in 1947, when Marine and Navy records were consolidated into a new centralized system. This restructuring revealed that many pre-invasion reconnaissance missions, including the one between Saipan and Tinian, had been logged under temporary task force numbers rather than permanent unit records. As a result, some operational details, including weather reports, movement logs, and radio transcripts, were misfiled or lost. The disappearance of the 4-man reconnaissance team likely fell victim to this administrative reshuffling. The ocean may have claimed their bodies, but paperwork confusion erased their final moments from official history. Modern historians reviewing these cases repeatedly confront the same challenge. The Pacific is vast, the battlefields chaotic, and the archival record incomplete. In some theaters, like Peleliu, environmental conditions were so extreme that remains could be sealed in caves or buried beneath collapsed coral formations. In others, such as the Gilberts, Japanese administrative practices varied wildly. Some units meticulously recorded POW captures, while others kept no logs at all. This inconsistency makes it nearly impossible to trace the exact fate of individuals who went missing in areas under Japanese control. And yet, behind every missing Marine lies a personal story marked by uncertainty. Families waited months, then years for official updates. Many continued writing letters long after the war ended, asking whether new intelligence had surfaced or whether unidentified remains might match their sons. The responses, crafted with bureaucratic precision, often read the same: "No additional information is available at this time." These were words meant to be gentle, but they delivered no closure. Today, the cases of the most forgotten Marines of the Pacific War remain unresolved. Forensic teams continue to investigate crash sites, search coral caves, and analyze archival documents as new information occasionally surfaces. Oceanographers model drift patterns from 1944. Archaeologists map ravines on New Georgia. Historians reassess captured Japanese diaries. Each effort holds the promise of an answer, but more often than not, the Pacific keeps its secrets. Their stories remind us that war is not only fought with bullets and bayonets, but with the fragile tools of record-keeping, memory, and communication. In the Pacific, the planet's largest oceanic battlefield, even the most determined investigations can founder against the vastness of the environment and the gaps in the archives. The 5 Marines whose disappearances we have examined stand as symbols of the countless unknowns still embedded within World War II's sprawling history. And so the final chapter of their story remains unwritten, not for lack of effort, but because the truth lies scattered across jungle ridges, ocean depths, and vanished wartime ledgers, awaiting discovery, or destined to remain forever out of reach.